Midnight on the high plains does not knock softly. It hammers. That is what Flint Caraway told himself when 3 sharp raps rattled his front door, the kind of knock that belonged to trouble, not to a stranger asking for shelter. He opened the door with his rifle low but ready, and there she stood. A woman, maybe 25 years old, her boots caked in 100 miles of red dust, her hands wrapped so tightly around a small leather satchel that her knuckles had turned white. She did not ask for food. She did not ask for a bed. She looked him dead in the eye and said 4 words that would change both their lives forever. "I need honest work." Flint almost laughed. Nobody came to his ranch by choice anymore, not since the drought took half his herd, and the whispers took the rest of his reputation. But something in the way she stood, spine straight despite her exhaustion, chin lifted despite the dirt on her face, made him step aside instead of shutting the door. He would spend the next 10 chapters regretting that decision and thanking God for it in equal measure. Because the woman on his porch was not running from poverty. She was running from a fortune, from a father who saw her as property to be traded, and from a secret, buried on Flint's own land, that powerful men would burn the whole territory to keep hidden. Before we go further, if you are the kind of person who loves a slow-burn romance wrapped inside danger, hit subscribe now, because this story only gets more intense from here. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I would love to say hello and picture all of us watching this unfold together, mile by mile, chapter by chapter. Now let's go back to that midnight and see how far one knock on a door can travel. Flint Caraway had built a wall around himself long before he built the fences around his cattle. 3 years earlier, a woman he had trusted with his whole heart packed a wagon in the dead of night and left him with nothing but a half-finished barn and a silence that never quite left the house. Since then, he worked the ranch alone, spoke to his horse more than he spoke to people, and told anyone who asked that he preferred it that way. The stranger on his porch did not care about any of that. Her name, she said, was Cassidy Doyle, and she needed work. Any work. Starting tomorrow if he would have her. Flint studied her face by lantern light. Her words came out polished, each one placed like a piece of good china. Nothing like the rough drawl of the drifters, who sometimes passed through looking for a meal. He noticed it, filed it away, and decided it was none of his business. "I don't pay much," he said, "and I don't ask questions. You don't ask me any either." "Agreed," she answered, too quickly, like a woman closing a deal before the other side could change their mind. He gave her the small room off the bunkhouse, the one his old ranch hand had used before he passed. She thanked him in a voice that shook only slightly, then closed the door, and Flint stood outside it for a long moment, listening to nothing at all. Inside, Cassidy pressed her back against the wood and finally let herself breathe. She had ridden for 6 days, sold her mother's ring in a town 2 counties back for a plain dress and a worn pair of boots, and told herself the entire way that disappearing into hard, honest labor was safer than staying one more night under her father's roof, where a wedding to a man 3 times her age was already being planned without her consent. She did not sleep that night. She practiced holding a shovel the way she imagined a real ranch hand would hold one, turning her soft palms over in the moonlight, dreading the morning when her life would have to survive daylight. Morning came anyway. Flint tested her before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, handing her a pitchfork and pointing toward the stalls without a word of instruction. Cassidy gripped it like a woman gripping a sword she had never trained with, and within an hour, her hands were raw and bleeding at the creases. She did not complain. She did not stop. Flint watched from across the yard, arms crossed, and told himself he was only making sure she would not slow him down. By sundown, blisters had opened on both her palms, and still she carried the last bucket of feed to the trough without being asked twice. Flint walked past her, glanced at her hands, and for the first time in 3 years, felt something crack quietly in his chest that had nothing to do with anger. "Wrap those," he said gruffly. tossing her a strip of clean cloth. "Can't work a ranch with hands falling apart." "Yes, sir," she said, and looked up at him, with an expression that was not quite gratitude, and not quite fear, but something caught between the two. Neither of them said another word that night, but both of them lay awake, wondering exactly who the other person really was. The days that followed tested Cassidy in ways she had never imagined. She learned to muck stalls until her arms burned, to mend fences under a sun that showed no mercy, to eat beans and cornbread without complaint, even though her stomach longed for the delicate meals of her father's dining table. She learned quickly, faster than most green hands Flint had ever hired, and that alone made him suspicious. It was the small things that gave her away, the way she instinctively straightened silverware at the supper table before catching herself and shoving her hands back to work, the way she read a torn newspaper left on the porch rail with the ease of someone who had studied literature, not just letters, the way she hummed a tune one evening while brushing down a mare, a melody Flint recognized from a traveling opera troupe that had once passed through the territory and charged more for one ticket than most ranch hands made in a month. "Where'd you learn that song?" he asked, leaning against the stable door. Cassidy froze mid-note. "Heard it somewhere," she said. "Can't remember where." Flint said nothing more, but he watched her a little closer after that, the way a man watches a storm cloud that has not yet decided which direction to travel. Annie, the ranch cook, noticed too. She had worked for Flint since before his marriage fell apart, and she had an instinct for people sharpened by decades of feeding strangers who passed through looking for work and sometimes looking for trouble. "That girl's got secrets," Annie muttered one evening while kneading dough, flour dusting her forearms like snow, hands soft as butter under those calluses she's forcing onto herself. "Mark my words, Flint Carraway. She's running from something bigger than bad luck." "Everybody's running from something," Flint replied, though the words sat uneasily on his tongue, because he was beginning to wonder exactly what Cassidy's something might be. That night, under a wide sky scattered with more stars than Cassidy had ever seen from behind a manor window, she sat on the porch steps beside Flint, both of them too tired to speak, yet neither of them willing to go inside. For the first time in weeks, she let her guard slip just slightly. "Does it get easier?" she asked quietly. "The work, I mean. Your hands get tougher," Flint said. "The rest of it, you carry. You just get better at carrying it, without anyone seeing the weight." Cassidy looked over at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice, and for a moment, the space between two strangers narrowed into something that felt almost like understanding. 3 weeks into her new life, the trouble Cassidy had run from finally caught a scent of where she might be hiding. Sheriff Wade Dunlap rode onto the property one dusty afternoon, his badge polished bright, his smile polished brighter, both hiding a man who took orders from whoever paid him best. And in this territory, no one paid better than Cattle Baron Reginald Doyle, Cassidy's own father. "Afternoon, Flint," Wade said, tipping his hat, while his eyes swept the yard with the practiced ease of a man cataloging every soul on the property. "Got word a young woman might have passed through here. Runaway, the family worried sick, offering a fine reward for her safe return." Flint kept his expression as flat as the horizon. "The only hands I got are the ones I hired myself. All accounted for, all working, none of them running from anybody. Mind if I take a look around? Mind if I ask why a sheriff's doing legwork for a bounty instead of sending a deputy?" Wade's smile thinned at the edges. "Just being thorough." Behind the barn, Cassidy pressed herself flat against the wood, heart hammering so loudly she was certain it could be heard from the yard. She had recognized Wade's voice instantly, a man who had dined at her father's table more times than she could count, a man who would recognize her face the moment their eyes met. She counted her own breaths to keep from making a sound. 1, 2, 3. Willing the seconds to pass faster than they seemed capable of moving. Flint walked Wade through the yard himself, steering him toward the far pasture, where 2 hired hands, Travis and Boone, worked mending fence lines in plain sight. making certain the sheriff saw exactly what Flint wanted him to see, and nothing more. When Wade finally rode off, dust rising behind his horse like a slow fading warning, Flint exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding. He found Cassidy still behind the barn, her back against the wood, her face pale beneath the dust and sun that had darkened it over the past weeks. "You want to tell me what that was about?" he asked, his voice low, careful, not accusing, but no longer able to pretend he had not noticed. Cassidy opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Not yet," she whispered. "Please, not yet." Flint studied her for a long moment, the same way he studied a storm rolling in from the west, deciding whether to bring the cattle in early or take his chances. Finally, he nodded once. "All right," he said. "Not yet, but eventually, Cassidy. The truth finds everybody. Better it comes from you than from a stranger with a badge and someone else's money in his pocket." She nodded, grateful and terrified in the same breath, and neither of them noticed Boone watching the exchange from a distance, filing away every detail like a man building a case he intended to sell. The branding season arrived with its usual chaos, smoke and dust, and the sharp smell of scorched hide filling the air from sunup to sundown. Cassidy worked harder than anyone expected, holding calves steady with a strength she did not know she possessed, until fear and necessity demanded it of her. By the third day, exhaustion had worn every wall down to its studs, and when a calf kicked loose and knocked her into the dirt, Flint was at her side, before she had even finished falling. "You're bleeding," he said, kneeling beside her, gently turning her arm over to examine a shallow cut along her forearm. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her voice cracked slightly on the second word. He wrapped the wound himself, his hands rough from decades of labor, yet surprisingly gentle in their movements, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the branding fire crackling nearby, the smell of dust and smoke settling over them like a shared blanket. "You ever wonder why I keep to myself out here?" Flint asked suddenly, surprising even himself with the question. Cassidy shook her head slowly. "I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to. My wife left 3 years back," he said, the words coming out plain and unadorned, stripped of the bitterness he usually wrapped around them. "Took what she wanted from this life and left when the ranch stopped being profitable enough for her taste. Told the whole county I was cold before she even packed her last bag. Made it easier for her to leave, I suppose, if everyone believed I deserved it." "That's not fair," Cassidy said quietly. "Fair's got nothing to do with it," Flint replied. "Life doesn't owe anybody fair. It just hands you what it hands you, and waits to see if you'll keep standing." Cassidy looked at him then, really looked, past the sunburn and the stubble, and the guarded eyes, and saw a man who had been broken and rebuilt himself anyway, brick by brick, day by day, without anyone to help carry the weight. It was the closest she had felt to another human being in longer than she could remember, and it frightened her more than any sheriff or bounty ever could, because losing her heart to this ranch and its owner was a danger no amount of running could outpace. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not asking me to explain myself before I'm ready." "Everybody's entitled to their own timeline," Flint said, standing and offering his hand to help her up. "Just don't wait so long. The truth catches up to you on somebody else's terms." She took his hand, and the warmth of it lingered on her skin long after the branding fire had burned down to embers. It happened by accident, the way most discoveries that change everything tend to happen. Flint had gone into the bunkhouse looking for a spare blanket during a cold snap, and found, tucked beneath a loose floorboard in Cassidy's room, a small gold locket engraved with a crest he recognized instantly. The same crest, stitched onto the coats of Reginald Doyle's men whenever business brought them through town. His hand still went around the locket. He had heard the name Doyle spoken with equal parts respect and fear across the territory. A cattle baron who had built his empire by buying out small ranchers who refused to sell, and by making the ones who resisted disappear quietly enough that no lawman ever asked too many questions. If Cassidy carried this family's crest, she was not simply a runaway servant or a woman escaping a bad marriage. She was tangled up in something far more dangerous than Flint had let himself imagine. He waited for her that evening on the porch, the locket resting heavy in his coat pocket, like a stone he could not put down. When she came in from the fields, dust-streaked and tired, he held it up without a word. Cassidy's face was drained of color. "Where did you find that?" "Under your floorboard," Flint said. "Cassidy, or whatever your real name is, I think it's time you told me exactly what I let onto my property." She sank onto the porch steps, the fight draining out of her all at once, replaced by something closer to relief, the exhaustion of a woman who had carried a secret so long that setting it down, even to her own detriment, felt like breathing after holding her breath for miles. "My name is Cassidy Doyle," she said. "Reginald Doyle is my father, and I ran because he was going to marry me off to a man who has buried 2 wives already, both conveniently, both quietly, both leaving my father richer each time. I am not hiding from poverty, Flint. I am hiding from becoming his next transaction." Flint sat down slowly beside her, the locket still warm from his pocket, the weight of her words settling over the yard like the first drop of a coming storm. "Why my ranch?" he asked quietly. "Out of every property in this territory, why here?" Cassidy hesitated, and in that hesitation, Flint understood there was more to the story than even this confession had revealed. "Because your land holds something my father needs erased," she finally said, "and I intend to find it before he does." The full truth came out slowly, painfully, like a wound finally being cleaned after being left untreated too long. Cassidy explained that her grandfather, decades ago, had witnessed her father forge a deed, stealing land from a group of settler families through fraud and quiet threats. Land that eventually became the very ranch Flint now called home. Her grandfather had hidden proof of that forgery, somewhere on this land, before her father's men silenced him for good. And Cassidy had spent years piecing together old letters and half-remembered stories until she was certain the evidence still existed, waiting beneath the soil Flint had spent his whole life working. "So this was never about honest work," Flint said, his voice tight, betrayal and understanding warring visibly across his face. "You used me to search my own land." "I did not know you when I arrived," Cassidy said, tears finally breaking free after weeks of forced composure. "I only knew I needed a way onto this property that would not draw attention. But Flint, I did not expect to start caring what happened to you. I did not expect any of this to feel real." "Feelings are easy to claim after you've been caught," Flint said, though even as the words left his mouth, he recognized the fear driving them more than the anger. "Then don't believe my words," Cassidy said, stepping closer despite the distance he had put between them. "Believe that I could have left the moment I found what I came for. Believe that I stayed, every single day, even after I started falling in love with a life I never thought I would want, and possibly with a man I never thought I would trust again." The confession hung in the space between them, raw and unguarded, and for a long moment Flint said nothing at all, wrestling with 3 years of caution against the undeniable pull of a woman who had just handed him the most dangerous truth of her entire life. "If your father's men are looking for that evidence," Flint finally said, "then they are looking for my land too, which means you didn't just bring your secret onto my ranch, Cassidy. You brought his hunters as well." "I know," she whispered, "and I am sorrier for that than I could ever put into words." Flint looked out over the darkened fields, the ranch he had rebuilt from nothing after his marriage collapsed, and understood that protecting it now meant protecting the woman standing in front of him too, whether his pride wanted to admit that or not. Trust, once broken, has a way of revealing every other crack in a place that seemed solid before. It was Boone who broke first, Flint's own hired hand, the quiet one who rarely spoke more than necessary, had been feeding information to Reginald Doyle's men for weeks in exchange for money he desperately needed to pay off debts from a card game gone wrong in town. Travis discovered the betrayal almost by accident, catching Boone counting a stack of bills far larger than any ranch hand's wages should allow, and confronted him behind the stables under a moon bright enough to see the guilt plain on Boone's face. "You sold us out," Travis said, disgust thick in his voice. "For what, Boone? A few dollars to cover your gambling? You don't understand what these men are capable of," Boone said, hands shaking. "I had no choice." "Everybody's got a choice," Travis snapped. "You just made the wrong one." By the time Travis brought the news to Flint, it was already too late to undo the damage. Doyle's men knew Cassidy's location, knew the layout of the ranch, and knew that whatever evidence her grandfather had hidden was somewhere on this property, waiting to be found before Flint and Cassidy could reach it first. "We have to move," Flint said, urgency replacing the careful calm he usually wore like armor. "Tonight, if we can." Cassidy nodded, fear and determination mixing plainly on her face. "There's an old surveyor's map my grandfather mentioned in one of his letters. If the evidence is anywhere, it's near the boundary marker by the northern ridge, the one nobody uses anymore since the creek shifted course." They rode out together under cover of darkness, Travis staying behind to watch the main house, while Annie kept a lantern burning in the window as a signal that all remained calm, at least for now. The northern ridge stood silent and forbidding under the moonlight, and as Flint and Cassidy dismounted near the old boundary marker, neither of them noticed the distant torches beginning to gather at the edge of the property, moving steadily closer with the patient confidence of men who believed the night belonged to them. The storm arrived without warning, the way high plains storms so often do, turning a clear night into a churning, violent sky within the space of an hour. Rain hammered the ridge as Flint and Cassidy dug frantically near the old boundary marker, lightning illuminating the desperate work in short, blinding flashes. "There," Cassidy gasped, her fingers closing around a rusted metal box buried just beneath the surface, exactly where her grandfather's letters had promised it would be. Inside, protected by layers of oiled cloth, lay the original deed, the forged signature, and sworn statements from 3 of the settler families her father had cheated decades earlier. Thunder cracked overhead, loud enough to rattle the ground beneath their boots, and Flint pulled Cassidy toward the shelter of a nearby line shack, just as the storm reached its full fury. Inside, soaked and breathless, they stared at each other in the flickering light of a single match Flint struck to light an old lantern. "We found it," Cassidy said, disbelief and relief tangled together in her voice. "We're not out of danger yet," Flint reminded her gently, though even as he said it, something in his chest had already shifted, settled, decided. He reached out and brushed a strand of rain-soaked hair from her face, his hand lingering longer than necessity required. "Flint," Cassidy whispered. "I know," he said quietly. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Cassidy, and I'm choosing to do it anyway." He kissed her then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that carried 3 years of loneliness and 6 weeks of growing trust into a single moment neither of them wanted to end. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small shack, something steadier and warmer had finally found its footing. Their peace lasted only until dawn broke, and the sound of approaching riders reached them through the thinning rain. Doyle's men had found the ridge, and they had not come to negotiate. Flint and Cassidy rode hard for the ranch house as the first shots rang out behind them, the metal box holding the evidence secured tightly against Cassidy's chest. By the time they reached the yard, Travis and Annie had already barricaded the main house, rifles in hand, prepared to hold their ground against however many men Reginald Doyle had sent to erase decades of buried guilt. The confrontation that followed tested every ounce of courage the small ranch possessed. Doyle's men set fire to the edge of the barn in an attempt to draw everyone out into the open, flames licking hungrily at dry wood, while smoke rolled thick across the yard. Flint fought with the desperate strength of a man defending everything he had rebuilt from nothing, while Cassidy, refusing to hide despite the danger, stood at the window with the evidence raised high enough for the approaching men to see clearly. "This is what your employer is really protecting," she shouted into the chaos, her voice steady despite the fire and smoke surrounding them. "Proof that everything he owns was stolen from families who trusted him. Burn this ranch down if you want, but the truth already has copies waiting with the territorial marshal, sent by the rider 3 days ago." It was a bluff, one final desperate gamble, but it worked exactly long enough for the sound of real riders to be heard approaching from the county road, drawn by smoke visible for miles, and by Travis's earlier message sent the moment Boone's betrayal had come to light. The territorial marshal and a dozen deputized men arrived just as the barn's flames were finally brought under control, and Doyle's remaining men, recognizing a fight they could no longer win quietly, scattered into the surrounding hills rather than face arrest. Reginald Doyle himself was arrested 3 days later, discovered attempting to flee the territory with whatever wealth he could carry, the forged deed and sworn statements providing exactly the evidence needed to strip him of both his stolen land and his remaining reputation. Cassidy stood beside Flint as the news reached them, watching the man who had controlled her entire life finally lose the power he had built on other people's suffering. "It's over," she whispered, disbelief still thick in her voice. "No," Flint said gently, taking her hand. "It's just beginning." The territory settled slowly in the weeks that followed. The settler families whose land had been stolen decades earlier finally receiving the restitution the courts ordered once Doyle's fraud became public record. Sheriff Wade Dunlap lost his badge and faced his own charges for accepting bribes, replaced by a lawman with no taste for looking the other way. Boone left the territory entirely, his betrayal following him wherever he went, a lesson learned far too late to undo the damage it had caused. Flint's ranch, once teetering on the edge of failure, found new life as word spread of the courage shown defending it, bringing new hands, new business, and a reputation built on honesty rather than fear. Cassidy chose to stay, not out of obligation or fear of her father's reach, which had finally been broken for good, but because she had found something on this dusty, difficult land that her father's mansion had never offered her, a place where her worth was measured by her character rather than her bloodline. On a quiet evening months later, Flint found Cassidy exactly where he had first noticed something different about her, brushing down a mare in the stable, humming that same opera melody she had once tried to hide. This time, when he asked where she had learned it, she did not deflect. "My mother used to sing it to me," she said softly, before she passed. "It's one of the only pieces of her I still carry." "Then keep singing it," Flint said, out loud. This time, "No more hiding what makes you who you are." She smiled, the first truly unguarded smile he had seen since the night she arrived on his porch, soaked in dust and desperation, and Flint understood, standing there in the quiet stable, with the woman who had once been a stranger and was now the center of his entire world, that some of the best things in life arrive disguised as trouble, knocking at midnight, asking only for a chance to prove themselves. They married that autumn, in a small ceremony, attended by the very settler families whose land had finally been restored, a celebration of justice, earned rather than power inherited. And on the ranch that had once known only silence and solitude, laughter became a permanent resident, echoing across fields that had finally, after so many years, learned what it meant to be truly, honestly, unshakably home. Every family watching this tonight can carry something forward from Flint and Cassidy's story. True strength is not measured by the wealth we are born into or the power we can command over others, but by the honesty we choose to live by, even when the truth is dangerous to speak. Cassidy could have stayed silent and safe. Flint could have turned away a stranger and kept his walls intact. Instead, both of them chose courage over comfort, and in doing so, found a life built on something far more lasting than either fortune or fear: trust, earned one honest day at a time. If this story moved you, Remember to subscribe so you never miss how these unforgettable journeys unfold. And please, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. I love reading every single one, and I would love to say hello to you personally as we keep discovering these stories together.